Hello, my lovelies, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, I was on Twitter the other day. I was sort of hanging around in the circles that the horror writer community frequents, and somebody asked a sort of collective question of all of us. They asked, do we feel that horror fiction and horror media can help us, those of us that experience mental health problems? Can it and does it in any way help? It was a very well worded question, I have to say, because of the way they worded it made it very subjective, which is the only way one can answer this. It's very difficult to answer this kind of question on a general level because, of course, you end up imposing on other people's subjective experience, which is often a problem. I can't speak for other people. It depends on what their influences are, I imagine. You know, what form or subjects of art or created things help you to process depends on your input, your influences, and your biases, your interests, you know, what fascinates you and what engages you. Some people, horror most definitely will not. In fact, I imagine for some people, horror would do more harm than good. I know a lot of people who can't handle horror at all. They don't have the background, they don't have the experience with it. So even very mild horror, they find extremely unpleasant and traumatic and refuse to engage with it, which is fine. You know, that's what their experience is. Now, for me personally, because my background is in horror, because I have associations with horror that go right back to childhood. I mean, I have nostalgic sentiment for things like Halloween, Hellraiser, Predator, Alien, all of this stuff, as much as I have nostalgic sentiment for cartoon franchises like Transformers or, I was going to say G.I. Joe, but I don't actually have it for G.I. Joe because I never got into G.I. Joe. I never really understood G.I. Joe myself. I never understood why in an arena where you've got giant transforming alien robots, you've got magic, you've got monsters, you've got demons, you've got dragons, why you would go for the franchise that's just people with guns. I've never understood that. It's just my personal biases coming out there. But yes, my sentimental associations are as strong and profound with sort of canonized works of horror as they are for children's franchises, because that was the nature of growing up in the 1980s. It's not universal, but it is the case that we as children had access to more media and more adult and more various forms of media than probably any generation that had gone before. Certainly, up to the advent of things like the internet. Obviously, the internet sort of blew that access out of the water. Now on the internet, you can literally get anything at the touch of a button. But up until that point, the liberation of media with home media, with things like VHS players and whatnot, and indeed video games, allowed us access to this stuff that really previous generations would have been prohibited from, except in the case of cinema, that kind of thing, and certainly would have been prohibited from when they were children. They would not have experienced this stuff when they were children, except for the rare occasions when horror films featured on TV and when they had the means and access to watch them. It would have been a much more forbidden thing. It would have been a much more profound and precious thing, I imagine, for previous generations than it was for us, because of course we had access to it. The VHS, most homes in the mid to late 1980s had access to fairly significant VHS libraries, and of course there were the now legendary and mythic VHS rental stores, which were just a part and parcel of culture in the late 1980s, right up until the mid-1990s with the advent of DVD, of course, and the beginning of the internet at home. VHSs were everywhere. I mean, my mother had the most amazing, and I remember it to this day. I wish she still had it. I really do. The most amazing VHS library that covered one wall of the living room, like just shelves upon shelves of VHSs. It was incredible. It was incredible. And as a child, it is it really was a kind of Aladdin's cave of wonders, of every kind, of every description. But one of the principal subjects was horror, because my mother loves horror. So I was exposed to it from a very young age, but I was also taught about it. You know, it wasn't the case that my mum just let me watch whatever I wanted, although I could watch whatever I wanted. It was the case that my parents would explain to me, like, look, this is... it's a fiction. It's not real. They would explain to me the special effects and all that kind of thing. They would explain to me, like, the fantastical nature of these films. So I was granted access to these things and these subjects from a very young age, and it's kind of ironic because my brother and I mean, obviously it's anecdotal and it's subjective, and we are just a very, very small example of this, but we were exposed to some of the most grotesque, violent, video nasty stuff you could imagine, and both of us are pacifists. I mean, both of us are pacifists. Both of us, we are non-violent creatures. You know, both of us abhor violence in the waking life, and I find that really fascinating. Given, the accepted pop psychology, Sun newspaper, tabloid cant regarding horror films and whatnot, I find that really fascinating. In fact, I know so many people who grew up with horror as just part and parcel of everyday life, who are pacifists, who've never been in any violent confrontation. Now, whether it had any other more profound effects, it's not for me to say, because I can't analyse the state of my own mind. None of us can. None of us can. I've discussed this with my friend Kit Power on What the Hell Is Wrong With Us before, but when people come to you and say, oh, I know my own mind, it's like, no, you don't. No, you do not. It's the one thing you definitely do not know. Of all the things that you can pretend or delude yourself you have objectivity on, your own mind is not it, I'm afraid. It's kind of simple in a way. It's because what you have when you're trying to analyze your own state of mind is both the subject and the instrument are mind. They are the same thing. You can't have an instrument analyzing itself via its own functions and processes when it's those very functions and processes that are under analysis. Yeah, you can't take whatever mind is. I mean, for a given definition, obviously, but when we start getting into semantics over what the mind is, then you're into deep waters. But you can't take the phenomena of mind, pluck it out, set it aside as a definite article or object, and then say, yes, so if you look here, you can see this string of influences that result in this particular reaction and this particular response. You can't do that. None of us can. It's impossible. Even therapists and counselors and psychologists cannot do that. It is largely impossible. We cannot know our own states of mind. So I can't sit here and tell you, oh, watching this or being exposed to that did this to me or did not do this to me. I don't know, and neither do you. Nobody does. Which is why I really hate... There's certain stock phrases in British culture I fucking loathe. One of them is, I know my own mind. The other one is, it didn't do me any harm. That one in particular is one I hate, because it's often used to justify atrocity and violence, and I hate it so, so much. It never did me any harm. Did it not? Well then, let's have a look at you and your relationships and your state of mind, and let's see exactly how damaged it actually is. Because all of us are damaged. All of us are damaged in very particular ways by what we experience, especially in our formative years. We are, there's a great documentary called The American Nightmare, which was shot in 2000, and The American Nightmare, it's this very question: why was there a sort of surfeit of incredibly smart, political, culturally reflexive mainstream horror from the late 1960s, arguably starting with Night of the Living Dead, although you can take it back to Hitchcock if you want to, really. And further than that, but really Night of the Living Dead is kind of a good touchstone for it. Right up until sort of around the early 1990s, that entire period, mainstream horror is dominated by incredibly smart, symbolic, cultural reflections of what is going on in the collective unconscious or subconscious. It's like they are exactly what the documentary calls them. They're waking nightmares. They're ways for which culture seems to be processing certain collective traumas. So when you look at American horror, it's obviously stuff like the escalation of civil rights, it's the the escalating abandonment and exposure of the lie of the American dream. It's political corruption. It's things like Watergate. It's Vietnam. Vietnam is arguably one of the most significant traumas in the American collective unconsciousness up until 9/11, and it resonates throughout the horror that's produced not only in the 1970s, but through the 1980s right up to the 1990s. It's still there now. The echoes of it are still there now. And that leads on to another question, doesn't it? It's, you could, when asked the question, does horror help you subjectively with your mental health? It then begs the question, well, does that work on a collective level? Does horror express and allow entire cultures to process collective trauma? And I would say yes. I would say on that level, I would say absolutely yes. When you look at how horror occurs, when you look at the trends of horror and the rhythms of horror on a collective level or on a historical level, then yes, absolutely it does. You tend to get, when you look at like what people tend to consider the golden ages of horror, it becomes rampant when you have an emergence from a collective nightmare. But unlike an individual nightmare, which you wake from, the resonance and the implications of historical nightmares continue on. You don't wake from the nightmare. You sort of emerge from it, stumbling and wounded and traumatized, And that's what Vietnam was for the USA. Alongside everything else, of course, it wasn't just Vietnam. It was the civil rights movement. It was riots. It was the assassination of Kennedy. It was the Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. It was all this stuff, all sort of the shooting of students by the American military at Kent State. It was all of this stuff, and all of it is in the horror of the era, even when it's not evidently so. Most of the horror, certainly out of the US of that era, are Vietnam films. You look at Last House on the Left. Last House on the Left, Wes Craven's film, is a nasty, dirty, horrific piece of sadism, but it's also an expression of a cultural trauma. There are even moments in that film that are deliberately framed and shot like the footage of atrocities being committed in Vietnam by American troops against Vietnamese citizens. There are deliberate shots that are framed in exactly the same way. It is expressing something, some degree of anger and fury and disgust at the state of the USA itself and what it's doing, not only in foreign territories, but to its own people, to its own youth specifically. You look at the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an expression of so much. It's Vietnam once again. It's the oil crisis, obviously. The reason the kids are stranded where they are is because they can't get any gas. It's the atomization of traditional family structures. So there is, of course, at this era, there is this incredible gulf between one generation and another, the sort of more conformist older generations and the younger generations that are rejecting the American dream. They are rejecting every prescription of the world their parents have created because they can see that it's bullshit. They can see that it's violent, aggressive, cannibalistic bullshit. The cannibalism, the violence in Texas Chainsaw Massacre isn't just there for in a puerile way. It's not just splatter, it's not just gore. And that said, there isn't that much in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, by the way. If you watch that film, almost everything is implied. You see almost nothing. There's barely an egg cup of blood in the entire thing. And most of it is on the lead actress by the end. It's a metaphor, it's a symbol, it's about what's happening in wider culture, There's also, John Landis said this, which I think is fucking brilliant. He said, John Landis, or was it Francis Ford Coppola? One of them, it was one of the really big horror directors of the era, it may have been Francis Ford Coppola actually, he said that when you look at the work of Alfred Hitchcock, for example, you are in an almost state of rapture because you're in the hands of a master. You know it's going to get pretty horrific, but it's always in a particularly almost symphonic or orchestral rhythm. When you look at the films of the 1970s, things like Last House on the Left, things like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you're not in the hands of a master, you're in the hands of a maniac, because those films throw out all the rules in exactly the same way that the youth of the era were throwing out the rules and restrictions of their parents. You know, there was a definite culture war happening at that point, and that's a lot of the time what these films are expressing, one way or the other. On an individual level, does horror help me? Yes, it fucking does. It's no hyperbole, it's no exaggeration to say that horror has saved my life on any number of occasions, because it has allowed me to process things that would otherwise have definitely killed me. There's absolutely no doubt. I mean, I've spoken about my various mental problems on this channel before. I'm very wary of it because I don't like woe is me narratives. I don't like the idea of people feeling sorry for me, which is probably a problem in and of itself, to be perfectly honest. But I'm not expressing it for sympathy, so please don't give me any, because I don't want any. There are people well worse off in terms of their mental health than I am. But I do suffer with things like social anxiety, depression, bouts of depression, which are very profound, and also a number of perceptual problems which tend to distort the world around me. So time is a problem for me a lot of the time, because time is this very elastic thing. So I find it difficult to measure. The sort of stability of the world is a problem for me. I find that difficult to process or apprehend because it's not stable for me. It's all over the place. It's a shifting, bizarre dreamscape a lot of the time. But what horror fiction and horror media has allowed me to do is metaphorically process that. It has provided the imagery and the situations and the subjects. It's like having a dream or a nightmare. It's like any kind of fantasy, and it doesn't really matter whether the subject is horror or whether the subject is this or that. It allows you a form of processing that you otherwise wouldn't. And we've discussed this on the channel before. The notion of the popular notion of escapism in fiction doesn't fucking exist. I'm really sorry. Even the most aesthetic, superficial, comic book, ridiculous, weightless pantomime of a piece of work is a kind of waking dream. And in that, it is allowing for the process of something. Even if it is very superficial emotions, it is allowing for the process of something. It wouldn't engage you otherwise. It would be frictionless. There would be nothing there for you to engage with if it didn't do that to some degree. So it doesn't really matter what the subject is. It can be cartoons, it can be fantasy, it can be realism, it can be whatever. It doesn't matter. They are providing arenas by which certain things can be processed, and they are not. I mean, the mistake people make often is that they look at like the literal subject matter, and they will say things like, so it's allowing you to process like murderous or sadistic impulses. No, it's not. Although that is part of it, definitely. That is definitely part of it, but no, that's not it. Very often the imagery is metaphorical. As we discussed with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the sadism in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre isn't meant to be taken literally. It's a wider cultural expression of things that are going on in a sort of collective subconscious. You know, it's a waking nightmare. It's a waking nightmare. And that's what good horror is. That's what good horror always does. It is engaged. It is reflexive. It taps into something cultural, you know? It taps into something political. And that's very interesting to be stating now, isn't it? At this point in time, when we're sort of maybe on the outer edge of certain collective traumas. We've had things like the Trump presidency. We've had the rise of the right. We've had COVID-19, we've had the pandemic. All of that stuff is now roiling and boiling around in culture, and I would not be surprised to see a massive efflorescence of horror very soon. Like, I wouldn't be surprised to see horror become mainstream again and to become very popular. Given the depth of the trauma that's happened and the degree of it, how sustained it has been, I would not be surprised to see horror become very mainstream again. For the first time in a long time, a very long time, I would not be surprised to see the efflorescence of maybe new personages, new saints of horror. You know, the last time that happened, arguably, was with the likes of Stephen King and Clive Barker, you know, in sort of like the late 1960s up to the mid 1980s, when you had a real efflorescence of horror, to the point whereby horror became one of the, if not the most profitable and culturally popular form of fiction in the Western world, you know? We may see that again. We may actually start to see new personages emerging and new concerns, new traumas being expressed through that. I kind of hope so. I can sort of give you an idea of who those people are going to be because I know some of them. Laura Marrow, who's been on this channel before, I can see her fiction going really far. I really can. I can see her work becoming like the basis for TV series, for films and whatnot, and being very, very interesting. Being just so fascinating. The kind of stuff you haven't really seen before. Definitely. Priya Sharma, All the Fabulous Beasts, her work, definitely. There has been, recently, an efflorescence in folk horror. Isn't that fascinating? Horror about the untamed world, you know, about going into places that the civilized human is not supposed to go into, and discovering secrets and lingering ancient things that are not supposed to be there. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, that is the subject for an entire other video. Why folk horror? Why has folk horror had an efflorescence over the last half a decade or so? There's been a lot of it, I can tell you. It's been very popular. You've also had a resurgence of certain classic subgenres as well, things like splatterpunk, for example. Splatterpunk is really popular. There are entire subgenres of fiction that you'll find if you go into the Evil Empire of Amazon, or if you just go onto Google and type in splatterpunk anthology, you'll find loads, some of which I'm in, by the way. If you go and find Fight Back, Splatterpunk Fighting Back, you will find some of my fiction in that. That whole series, actually, the Splatterpunk series that Jack Bantry and Kit Power edit, really good, really bloody good. Lots of subgenres, actually, lots of subgenres. You've had, of course, the efflorescence of almost a new kind of horror, which hasn't really had a voice before. Things like His House on Netflix, which explores the tensions between people of one culture being forced to take up home in another, where they are carrying the ghosts and the echoes of their own cultures with them, but also meeting new ones along the way. I mean, His House is brilliant. His House explores the tension between refugees in the UK who are fleeing war-torn cultures and countries, absolute atrocities, and finding themselves landed in this grey nowhere that is the UK, this cultural wasteland. And it comes down to some very interesting conclusions, I can tell you. Some very interesting conclusions indeed. But yeah, you're getting that. You're getting horror like Jordan Peele's horror, you know, which is exploring racial tensions, which you didn't really have much of before. It's definitely there. I mean, Night of the Living Dead is definitely about it's about lynchings. It's about race relations. It's about the racial tensions in the US. You know, that's definitely what it's about. Things like Candyman. Candyman is obviously about racial tensions. A lot of films are, but not to the same degree and not on the same intimacy. And there is the sad inevitability that it's always from a white writer and director's perspectives, unfortunately. For the more classic canonized films, always. There's hardly an instance where it isn't, sadly. But yeah, that's fascinating to me. Things like the internet, new experiences, new modes of communication are causing an efflorescence of new kinds of horror. Things like Host, which we've reviewed on this channel already. I can imagine seeing a lot of horror dealing with that stuff very, very, very soon. But yeah, it's fascinating to me. The whole discussion is fascinating. It led on to, from a discussion of individual trauma and can horror help with the processing of that, to wider cultural or political examinations. And that for me is absolutely fascinating, because of course the individual and the political are not disconnected. They're all one. They're all expressions of one another. So if it works on an individual level, if it occurs on an individual level, it almost certainly occurs on a collective level to some lesser or greater degree. It's fascinating. And I'm interested to see what, for example, in about 10, 20 years' time, university students looking back at this era, because they will be getting this era as sort of essay subjects, absolutely, in English classes, in philosophy classes, in sociology classes, in history classes, looking back at this era and examining, autopsying all of the various events and occurrences and traumas and how they were expressed, not only in fiction, but culturally and politically. That is going to be fascinating. Until next time, my loves. Bye-bye.